And one of the things that I'm very grateful for is that I've been living in my life and living in my passions almost my entire life, which means I'm a misfit. Because I don't get along necessarily with those who try to create rules around me. I'm not a rebel without a cause, and I never was in the principal's office, so I never was called out for not following rules, except I did go against government bodies and help change them. And I've been a protector of innovation, but really what I'm truly passionate about, there are a couple of things I am passionate about. One is preserving awe, AWE, the awe from awesome. Many of you may or may not know that awe is associated as being the 11th emotion that we have. Awe will create endorphins in your body. Experience awe brings you to creative heights from which you can do many amazing things. And that where I connect the awe with awesome happens to be in preserving the night sky. Something which I only came about through another talk, which I am not sharing here, but I realized that from my own personal life experience, right, that I know from creation through the Middle Ages, through the first Industrial Revolution, whenever the skies, whatever the weather would permit it, we'd have the opportunity to look up and see the stars quite clearly. In fact, until about the 1850s, anywhere on Earth, you could actually see the same intensity, same beautiful night sky. And starting in the 1850s specifically, I know of documented scientific breakthroughs that happened because people were inspired, and they said so, by the galactic center of the Milky Way being that source energy for them. And as life would have it, as we became more, as we went through multiple industrial periods of time, light pollution became so strong that, and we do have other pollutions. We have land pollution, we have air pollution, we have ocean pollution. We've polluted everything we can possibly pollute. But the thing is about light pollution, all it requires is flipping a switch and you can bring it back. But we're living in a moment in time where less than 20% of the people who live on Earth can look up and see the night sky. And that greatly concerns me. Because for someone who's a misfit, who looks for outsources to be inspired, for us to shut down the natural beauty of something, to take it away from us, and have to rely on arguably AR, VR technologies to see what we could normally naturally have seen. Because for me, when I first saw the Milky Way, which I was 50 years old when I did that, when I first saw the Milky Way, I looked up into the stars and I saw the galactic center of the Milky Way. I realized that the phrase that sometimes you have to walk into the darkness to see light may have been said a billion times before me, but I lived that. And I felt that. And then ever since then, I've been drawn to find environments that haven't lost their skies yet, and to work with the governments and the people to help build up what's astrotourism. And places which promote their stars, promote the sand, the sun, and the surf, don't realize there's also stars and skies to promote. And so part of me is always trying to preserve the awe of awesome, trying to inspire creativity as a building block for something. But for me, it's just realizing and understanding that who I am, and having the strength that despite whatever else may be around me, to allow myself to be a misfit. And I don't mean that in a negative way at all. I mean, I've spoken to, I think the hardest talks I ever give has been to like junior high school students, or high school students, where I talk about entrepreneurship and stuff. Because if I go to an MBA program and I talk about business success, and I tell people success doesn't exist, but true failure is not learning from your mistakes. And then I go around the room and I look for people who want to be entrepreneurs, and I look for everyone else who wants a corporate job, and I give people, so in the high schools I ask people who wants to work for themselves. And you'd be surprised how many people are very independently minded who want to work for themselves and no one else. And the opposite, but to get people in MBA programs to actually admit that they just spent $130,000 for an MBA, and they actually want to start their own company, it's pretty good. And I get great joy out of trying to evoke conflict in the soul to help break people away from the path which they're told to need to be on versus the path which they feel they need to be on. And so there's always this inner conflict. So for me, how I got here was discovering my voice. So the book that one day perhaps we'll read is called Finding My Frequency. And I think Tesla got it right. I think life is all about energy, vibration, and frequency. I think he may have been misunderstood in his later years, but I think he really got a lot of what he was trying to say, at least preserved. But for me, living a life as a young kid, it wasn't that I didn't have friends. You know, it's funny, the story I share a lot, and sometimes you say the same thing over and over and over and over again, it becomes real. So what I'm sharing with you is a slightly fictionalized accounting of my life, as I remember it, but to make a point. And that's that when I was really young, I went to school, and this is like second, third grade, right? I don't know how many of you remember those days, but for me, what I remember was being alone. And it wasn't that I didn't have people to connect with. It's just that I chose not to be with them. Because I can't say that people were transparent to me, because that's rather obnoxious, but I could see through people lying to me. And that was quite obvious. And lying, even white lies, but they were not talking the truth. The one thing my dad tried to teach me is to talk straight. Say what you mean and be that. So when I'm in second or third grade or fourth grade and people are not doing that back to me, I feel like I don't belong here. And I was like the only person without plans each day to go do something with somebody. I did take a bus to get to this school because I was out of town. But I realized, in fact, my parents thought something was bad with me. They sent me some shrink to see me. I tried to shrink the shrink, but I did actually. You get to play around sometimes. You have to understand what you're dealing with, even if you're just 9 years old. But what I ended up doing, which really I didn't do, was actually my dad's doing, is one of my father's brother was a ham radio operator. And my dad would always tell me to call my Uncle Fred. And I didn't know my uncle that well. I didn't see him that often. But I saw him from time to time. And the last thing I would ever talk about with my uncle would be radio. But my father knew growing up with his brother, there was something special about him. And I was very passionate when I was a young kid about music. But I got to be so lonely with trying to find friends that I would actually ask these people what music they liked and made their music my music so I could find something in common to talk to them about. It wasn't until I was like 16 or 17 that I actually find my music. I spent a long time trying to find something in common to communicate at a frequency that made sense. But for me, so I'm in I don't know, probably, I thought it was 9, but I think I did some research. I was 10 years old. So when you write a book, you actually have to have facts. So I was 10 when this happened, but I'm home from school, and one day my uncle picks me up from my parents' house and takes me to his office. My uncle happens to be many things. One of them happens to be a pioneer in cable TV. In the 1960s, he created some of the first test equipment that was used for rollouts of cable TV systems, and his company went public in the early 70s, from which I'm talking from. He had a factory in Farmingdale, New York. And what I remember about this day, of all days of my life, I can still visualize being picked up, going to his car, going to the factory, and getting a factory tour. I also remember that I wasn't impressed, because everybody was so nice to my uncle, saying hello to me, embracing me, being polite. I figure they all work for him, so why do they have to be, of course they have to be nice to him. So I just dismissed that. And then it was this thing about being in a room, maybe his office was maybe there, this area, and he had 2 chairs, a desk, and he was on one side of the desk, and there was this box. And I realized only after that there was a microphone near that desk, near that box. And this is what changed my life, was when my uncle flipped the switch, this box started to glow. Started to glow because there were radio tubes inside. So those of you who do not know what a radio tube is, we can have a different conversation sometime, but there was a time before we got so embedded that we had radio tubes, and they did glow. And as I sat there, being mesmerized by what I was listening to, I heard noise. The best part was my uncle heard voices. And he would tune this dial very finely, and it really sounded very garbled to me. In fact, I remember not understanding, just pretending, oh yeah, of course, and I have no idea what he's talking about. And he finally found a spot where there was silence. And he spoke a very cryptic language, one that I now know fluently, but I didn't know then. And he very eloquently said, CQ, CQ, this is K2QQM calling CQ. And he would say again, CQ, CQ, this is K2QQM calling CQ. He repeated that for a minute, and he let go of this microphone. And for an hour, my uncle was talking to people all over the world in English. What I would tell you is that the letter C and the letter Q, which da 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 da, for those of you in music will notice that da 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 is actually the bass line for a lot of 70s disco songs. I don't know what the correlation is, other than there were a bunch of musicians back in the 70s who were also into tech, into radio, and da 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 da, that bass beat is in a bunch of songs. But it means CQ, it comes from Morse code. The letter C, letter Q, like I'm seeking you, like you're seeking out. Those of you who might remember one of the first successful internet messaging platforms, ICQ. That was like an internet CQ. That was created by the son of my friend Yossi Vardi, and Yossi's a ham operator, at least was. And so he named the product ICQ to seek out over the internet, but to seek out someone. And so my uncle would simply say his name was Fred, he was in Farmingdale, New York, and he gave a signal report of how loud or softly the person was. And I was just mesmerized by this whole concept that my people wanted to talk to my uncle, let alone stay in a queue for an hour. I didn't realize it was so popular. And when all this was over, I realized at the end of the day that my uncle had the cure for loneliness for me. And I was like, screw school. I have this box. Put this box in my bedroom before I go to school in the morning, and after I come home from school in the afternoon, I could have friends all over the world. Doesn't matter where I am in Queens or ultimately Great Neck. I could have friends anywhere, maybe just not where I was. But my uncle, I thought, was a kind man, but I asked to take the radio back, and he said no. He said no. And then he explained to me that in order for me to have this radio in my possession, I had to study and pass a test. And I didn't quite understand that part. No one told me that this was going to lead up to a test, but it turned out that even for the most basic license, I had to teach myself college-level physics, Morse code, and then I was for the first time in my life, introduced to regulatory policy, because I had to read, I think, 97.1, which is from the Federal Communications Commission. That was the chapter of the law that regulated amateur radio operations in America. So I had to study that, learn Morse code, teach myself college-level physics, and so I learned a lot about failure at 9 years old, or 10 years old, because it took me multiple times. But finally, when I was 12 and a half, I finally got my ham radio license. And I like to say that ever since I had that license to communicate, I haven't shut up. But I finally felt an opportunity to bond with almost anyone, because amateur radio is a brotherhood, in the sense that if you met somebody and you said you're a ham operator, did not know, matter where I was, I could be connected to that person. And in ham radio, you just go by first name. It doesn't matter if you're a diplomat, because I spoke to ambassadors. One of my very close friends growing up, in fact, was my friend Danny, my ear. And Danny, and the thing about amateur radio that I really loved was the ability to experiment. So back in the 70s, it cost money to make a long distance call. Actually, from this part of Manhattan to another part of Manhattan cost money. If you called from Manhattan to Queens, it cost money. God forbid you had to call from Queens to somewhere in California. That was a lot of money. If you're going to call overseas, forget about it. And so what was very popular with ham operators was phone patching. The idea that you could actually have a box that bridged from a radio to the telephone. So if I had relatives or friends in Canada who wanted to speak to people in New York City, I would patch them in. In Puerto Rico, the same thing. And then in Israel, for some reason, the Israelis were able to. There actually were laws about what countries you can patch in and can't patch in, and you could never talk about business. It had to be just personal. But this guy Danny realized I was in New York. He had relatives in New York, and he would just ask me for phone patching all the time. I said, whatever. And so one of my friends from my town asked, did I know anyone in Israel? Because he was going with his family for the first time to Israel. I knew one person, Danny. And I asked Danny if my friend could visit him. He said, sure, any friend of yours is a friend of mine. Because that's what things were like. And back then we didn't have the internet, we had no texting. I got a letter, a postcard from my friend Sandy, who said, "Dear Jeff, either Danny is very patriotic or something is up," because I had to go through a scanner to go see him in his apartment. And at the end of the summer, I got a message, check out how Danny spells his name. So I only knew this guy as Danny, 4Z4UX, up RZ/UX, and we communicated very politely, very nicely, and but he always said his name was Danny Meyer, never thought twice, but it was spelled M-E-I-R. It turned out that my friend Danny was one of the 3 grandsons of Golda Meir, and it so happened that Golda Meir was living in his apartment at the same time. and so, just so happened that was how it was like. And so that was one of my first friends that I had, true friends on the radio, and I grew up over the years, and I see Danny from time to time. But it was that connection of bonding where we didn't question what people looked like, we didn't question about what people did for a living. It was always about passion. Our conversations on radio, boring as they may be, were all about stuff that maybe didn't matter, but maybe mattered to the soul so much. And that, for me, being able to communicate and find friends, and it was that journey I had, by the way, during the 2+ years I went through learning about failure, trying to pass this test. And I went to 201 Varick Street, which was where the FCC was. I went there time and again to actually, because I got a novice license, that was easy, but I wanted to get a general. And so I learned about, my parents enabled a lot of basic things in me. One of them being obsessive was okay. And they encouraged my hobbies without limits, so I went all in. And I went all in, and sometimes I did things that were not necessarily good. Anyone here currently have any relatives who work for the Federal Communications Commission? I think the statute of limitations is up anyway. So one of the things that group of people that I grew up with, there was a guy named Abby Hoffman who wrote a wonderful book called Steal This Book. And when I was in 3rd grade, it was my Bible. And I learned all about phone phreaking and hacking as a 3rd and 4th grader. I may have done some bad things, but relatively speaking, not so bad things. But I was experimenting. Who's to say, who knew that a certain touch tone sound gave you dial tone on a payphone? Amazing how that was. And so one of the things I was fascinated with was radio. So, and with amateur radio, we had an AM, we could broadcast in single sideband or AM. And has anyone here ever listened to shortwave radio? Anyone? Ever? Some of you. So outside of New York City with AM and FM, there's shortwave. So one night, on a winter night, I decided to launch a pirate radio station. But I wasn't doing it on AM or FM, I did it on shortwave. And I was WARG, shortwave's best rock, coming to you live from somewhere on the East Coast. That was me. I was Ray Haber. And the thing about Steal This Book that I learned about was that there's things called loop lines. So if you call 212-976-9977, you'd hear, And if you call 212-976-9979, which is the number I gave out, you'd get connected. And if you did a trace on that, at least that phone pair connected to a phone booth in the South Bronx. So guess who I volunteered into taking requests for WARG? My sister, Lauren and Michelle outside. Well, Lauren and Michelle's not here, but Lauren and Michelle. Now, being very cognizant that I might have been breaking the law a little bit, I was on shortwave. I was on 41 meters, so for those of you who know 41 meters. And as a kid, as a 13 or 14-year-old kid, I might have been on 6.969 megahertz, who knows. But that might have been the frequency I chose to put the broadcast out. But I was very cognizant of the law. So WARG had a life of 10 years. I only operated on stormy winter nights and on federal holidays. That was it. But I always warned my sisters that if they see a white van coming down the driveway to let me know so we could get out, coming after us. I'm sure if we actually ask Lauren about this, she'll tell you. Now, can you guess in the 70s what major businesses might have been using loop lines besides Ray Haber from WARG? Who would use these lines? Police? Maybe, but for a different reason. What do you think? How about prostitution and drug dealing? It turned out that my sisters were harassed by hookers and dealers to get off their line because we were breaking their traffic. But that was my introduction to entrepreneurship and creativity. I might have broken some laws along the way of doing so, but I created a reality for myself that I could thrive in. I tried talking to teachers, even my parents, about some of the things I was doing. I mean, look, 12th grade, I'm in 12th grade, about to graduate high school. I wrote we had an assignment, The Me That Nobody Knows. So I wrote about being Ray Haber from WARG, running this, right, because I was still running it back then. I stood up in front of the class, and my teacher said, "That was great fiction." He gave me a D. No one believed me. Now, how do you prove a negative? And no one in Great Neck, where I was living, actually had shortwave, so I couldn't get them to listen to my radio station. And I wasn't about to give them any tapes of me being on the air, because it could have maybe been incriminating. But it sort of like set me off in a whole path of finding ways within pockets to find a pocket of safety for myself. And the other thing about ham radio at an early age is that I learned everything you needed to know about being successful in social media when I was 13. I say this because when you're 13 years old and you live on Long Island, and Chris would remember this, if you're 13, most of the people you're talking to are men in their 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they're what? They're complaining about, with all due respect, about their wives and about their jobs. And as a 13-year-old kid, I didn't have a girlfriend. I didn't have a job. I had nothing to talk about. I had nothing to complain about. In fact, I was very happy. I was very excited. And so I learned to listen, to connect, to share, and engage. Those are 4 words I always teach people and coach people on in social media. And if you learn, because when you're 13, you have to listen. You have to listen to what the person is talking to, or they're not going to talk to you. You have to find something way to connect. Find something, share it to meaningful, and you want to engage in that conversation. So it became a time where ham radio was my place, my home. I could tune the dial. I didn't have to listen. I didn't have to talk. I could know the person's voice simply by tuning into them. I could listen to these people chat for an hour. I could kibitz with them. It did not matter. But I found a home, and it was radio. And the reason or how I ended up, so radio for me was not just a technology. It was a life. It was how I lived. And it was my first creative environment. I would like to say personally that I did a lot more music. I did music later on in my life when I started a record label, but when I was in 11th grade, I was very awestruck going to parties, as shy as I was. And there's one guy in high school who's an amazing piano player. And he got all the girls. And I was like, oh my God. And if he's getting girls, then I can get girls. So for 12th grade, I got piano lessons. And I'm very happy that the first few weeks I went from doing basic scales to actually doing some improv. I learned the blues. I taught myself some Billy Joel. But I was upsetting my music teacher, and I was also seeing numbers, and I was converting numbers into music, and I was composing. But I was upsetting my music teacher because I wasn't doing the structure of what he wanted me to do. And then this fateful day in June, before I graduated high school, this guy, Jean Valjean, tells me, of all things to tell a 17-year-old kid, he tells me, you know, Jeff, you're doing pretty well, but you could have been great, but you started too late. And I actually haven't played piano since. I tried about 10 years ago, but to be shut down, that bothers me. But I'm a misfit, right? So I find ways to hack, to get around, and to hack my life. So for me, the way I ended up becoming myself was understanding that there are laws. I understand ignorance to law is no excuse. And there are regulations, but there's creativity. And so for me, the biggest thing about being on ham radio and having a phone patch is that it was a mental connection that I made, because in all time, when I got involved in tech, I was very much involved in the edge of innovation. Didn't always know it, but that's where my head was at. I was always on that cutting edge of something. And right out of college, actually, so when I was in high school, one of the benefits of having a record collection is I actually had, and no social life, is I actually started a DJ production company. So girls who would not invite me to their parties paid me to DJ their parties. And that business is still going on today. My friend Jerry, who did not come today, runs that, but it's been around for 40 years or so. I also, when I was in high school, started a consulting company, and a software development company. And I didn't realize that, I did that because I didn't know you couldn't do it. No one said no, right? So not knowing I couldn't do something enabled me to do many different things. But the biggest change in my life was when I started a software company, I became an expert in fixed income mathematics, which I won't get into, but somehow for 3 years I ended up working on Wall Street in capital markets at Cantor Fitzgerald Securities, back when the internet started to happen. And so I had several responsibilities, but one of them was I was the internet guy. So I got to hang out and go to places, meet people, and play. And in 1994, I discovered video on the internet. Any of you remember See You, See Me? Some of you? And we had like this 120 by 160 black and white image that if we got 5 to 7 frames per second, that was a lot. That was my world. And I was so enthusiastic about that. And then I found out being on the See You, See Me mailing list in December of 94, I found out that soon there'll be software that comes out that lets me talk on the internet. So it happened to be February 12th, 1995. A small company from Israel called Vocaltech issued the software. I just very conveniently made sure I was homesick from work that day. And I downloaded the software, and it was the first iPhone. The iPhone did not come from Silicon Valley in 2007. That's just mythology. It came from Israel in 1995, arguably 94 when it first debated. But I downloaded the software, and as a social media identifier, I used my ham radio call sign, WA2BOT. To my utter amazement, about 20% of the people on iPhone were also ham operators too. And we had this very awkward conversation because we're in ham speak when we're talking to each other, and very awkward because we didn't need antennas or radios or anything. We just needed to have connectivity and a microphone and a computer. And this was fun. And I created a mailing list immediately, like within a week, so people who were on iPhone could find each other. That mailing list ended up growing to 3,000 people like really fast. And I had no background in telecom whatsoever. I had background in other things, but not that. And people started asking questions about how iPhone worked, and so I answered it. Now I didn't work for Vocaltech, but I answered it. But very quickly I became known for being an expert in internet telephony, even though I was simply a user like everybody else. A rather bullish one, but I was very, very enthusiastic about it. And then in September 1995, while I was at my day job, someone posed the question, is it possible to interconnect a telephone and a computer? And I dusted off my old phone patch, connected it, and it worked. I got dial tone. So I said yes. What I didn't know was that there was a guy from Indonesia who was on my mailing list who had a lot more time in his hands than I did. And for those of you who were engineers in the room, it turned out that in 1995, there were 2 types of chipsets that were popular in modems. One was Cirrus Logic, one was Rockwell. If you happen to have had a Cirrus Logic chipset modem, you were able to put 2 of those in a computer with a sound card. One could give you internet access, the other one gave you dial tone. I immediately had this idea for something called free world dial-up. Something that was free, connected the world, and ran on dial-up. And a month later, I announced and launched free world dial-up. And this was the first phone network, 7 years before Skype. This was the first phone network that ran on the internet. The only reason I even got the idea for it was because it was like phone patching on ham radio. Now there was no quality of service, there was no echo cancellation, there was no echo buffer, no jitter buffer. It was terrible, but it worked. Most amazing journalism in my life I ever saw was a month later, in November, the weekend of Thanksgiving in America, the Sunday Times of London had a story about Bill Gates and the road ahead. On the back page, it talked about free world dial-up and the threat to the future of British telecom. Now, I happen to tell you that we had no business plan, we had no scale, but they wrote about this as if we were like the second coming of something. And it wasn't just the Sunday Times of London, all over the world. I had so much publicity, I didn't know what to do about it. I was on TV, and not because I worked at Cantor, because I did this other hobby. And then in March of '96, 300 phone companies filed at the Federal Communications Commission a petition asking for the sale and use of internet telephony software to be banned in America and the makers to be regulated as phone companies. And I'm like, what the fuck's going on? And on my mailing list for 3 days, it was nuts. And people were panicking and they're saying, Jeff, what are you going to do about this? Every email was almost, Jeff, what I was going to do about it. Thank you very much, but I may have not liked my job on Wall Street, but I did not know anything about lobbying. I didn't know anything about what's going on. I said nothing. Because I didn't think I was qualified to do anything. I didn't realize I just had to be. So transformation number whatever happened there, because I took action, and I got 110 companies from my mailing list to get together. And I created something. In '95, I very creatively created the term VON to stand for voice or video on the net. And I created the VON Coalition. It was a very not-for-profit, ethereal company, since it was just imagination. But we announced opposition to the petition. Do you know, for 9 years we kept voice over IP unregulated in America? And the only reason the VON Coalition existed is because I didn't let someone say I couldn't do it. I have to confess that when I was working on Wall Street in '94, I had an idea to do a startup for web-based email, but someone told me it was a stupid idea, so I didn't do it. And then I had this other idea to do mortgage brokering on the internet, and I asked another friend, and they said it was a stupid idea, so I didn't do it. Eventually I realized I need new friends. Eventually I realized that I had to stop asking out and start listening inside, and allowing me to set direction. And not outsourcing my life. I always tell these people when I mentor, that you may or may not be the CEO of your company, but you've got to be the CEO of your life. And there's certain things you can't outsource, is your direction. And it's not whether you're qualified to do something or not. You're the only one who could disqualify you. Right? Innovation happens because you see it and someone else didn't. Tom Petty never would have become Tom Petty if you listen to all the people who said no to him. It just took one yes, and his legacy is in front of us. Of course, the music industry was much different back then, but many no's turns to one yes and becomes unbounded. So I started the VON Coalition, and then I conveniently got fired, which saved my life, by the way, which I'm forever grateful for. And then when I got fired, I actually started a conference business. On September 10th and 11th, '96, at the Puck Building, I held the first ever conference in North America about the future of voice and video on the internet. And then in '97, I changed the name from the Talking Net to VON, to stand for Voice on the Net. And I will end on that just to mention that there was this one guy who had a dream who came to the VON conference in '97. His name was Mark. He grew up in Dallas, and he had a dream that if you grew up in a hometown, you were passionate about connecting to where you grew up from. For him, it was high school sports. So he created a company called AudioNet, where you could tune over the internet and dial in to the radio stations from where you came from. I was also passionate about radio on the internet back then, because I actually was, because of my guilt of running a pirate radio station, I went legit, and I had Real Audio Server number 10 back in '95, and I became a moderator for what became Real Network's audio mailing list. But this guy Mark comes to VON in '97, he pitches his company, and 3 years later, he sells it for like $4.6 billion. His name was Mark Cuban. I still know him as Mark. Someone with a dream, who saw an opportunity that he was passionate about and never let go of. And for the 10th anniversary of VON, I tried getting Mark to come back and just talk about it, because at that point he already sold to Yahoo and stuff. He said, Jeff, dust off my old PowerPoints and share them, because my vision for what could be still hasn't happened. But the thing is, for me, life is about serendipity and synchronicity. It's about being open to the opportunities that are in front of you. And for me, it's about being a misfit. Knowing that I don't get fit in, and that's okay. I don't judge. I'm always being judged. If you want to screw me up, ask me to define myself in 5 words or less, and I'm screwed, So I talk about all of this to encourage everyone to find their inner misfit. Even if you work in a corporate job, to find that place that unleashes your passion for you, to empower yourself to be. My dad taught me many things. Being a young entrepreneur, he tried to tell me things that I'd only appreciate. It's like funny how your parents seem much smarter as you get older. And I miss my dad. He's been gone for 20 plus years now. But he tried to explain to me that if you don't ask, the answer is no. It just turns out to be true. And he taught me that the best gift you can give anyone is to believe in them, and to look for people who don't even know to believe in themselves, and find those people. So I started a record label for a few years, which I did because I love finding bands that were trying on the cusp of making it. I wanted to be their stepping stone. So I of course failed at that, but I had fun I failed because it was another life lesson, because I didn't put my heart and soul 100% into that. I was still running my conferences, but I was so passionate about music. And I really learned that the next person you meet can change your life. And that just because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. My friend Gio, if I gave him the microphone, he'd be talking about making good mistakes. Most of the things we have in our lives day to day, someone didn't go out to invent, it was stumbled upon. And even if you're going out to cure some deep medical condition, you stumble across a cure for something else. When you're not least looking for something, it happens. And thank God, by the way, that free world dial-up was free. People on the mailing list wanted to charge money for it, but it turns out that if you were charging even a penny a minute for reselling that service, you'd be in jail or shut down. But AT&T tried that, but it turned out there was no laws for free. Free has been and continues still to be unregulated. And the reason why, in a different situation, when I share my life story or parts of it, the first thing I always ask people is, how many people here use FaceTime or Skype or WhatsApp or Messenger? And I say, whatever it is. And then I ask people, how many people here pay for it? And most people would either say no and then I say, you're welcome. Because my true claim to fame was, I had this premonition, and I don't know, maybe this is an open group and you'd admit that maybe seeing things or feeling things or knowing things, but I woke up in January 2003 in a sweat, scared out of my mind. In bed, scared out of my mind. Thinking or realizing that the phone companies, as polite or evil as they may be, that they would realize how disruptive broadband would be to their life. And so I woke up with a mission that I had to protect the future, that had come from the future to protect this moment in time. And so what I went around is I went to my lawyers who I used to create the Vine Coalition. I said, hey, can we be proactive? Is it possible to be proactive? I said, sure, why? I said, well, I'm afraid that when the phone companies come out of the dot-com crash and telecom crash and the effects of 9/11, that they're going to start realizing how disruptive broadband was to their future. Oh, well, what do you want to do? Well, something very simple, just regulatory clarity, that voice communication that starts on the internet should not be regulated as telecom. Oh, sure. So it took 5 weeks. They drafted a petition. They filed it in February 2003. And after it was filed, my friend Glenn, who sometimes comes to these breakfasts, said, congratulations. I said, why? Well, we got it. We filed the petition. I said to Glenn, when's the fight going to start? Jeff, listen, if you're hearing Martian signals in your ears, and you file a petition at the FCC for them to block the Martian signals, there's a good chance they're not going to act on it. But feel good that you got your thoughts together and you filed. Most people would never do what you did. But it became, be careful what you wish for. Because 10 days later, the Federal Communications Commission took my petition and put it out for public comment. And for those of you with any type of regulatory background might know that it became a pleading cycle. So for 30 days, my petition's out for public comment. Most people in telecom were against it. Some people attacked my credibility. Other people attacked the construct of what I was asking for. Other people just were negative because it's hard to be positive. Very few people supported it. Then I had 30 days to reply back. Then in May of 2003, if you don't know this story, the humor part is that the DOJ and FBI went after me. This is the Department of Justice and the FBI. The reason why they were against the petition is because they accused me of harboring Al-Qaeda. They believe that if this petition was granted, that they will not be able to do broadband wiretaps. Hello, they say. But they actually, and you know what? When you're at an impasse like that, you got to talk, right? You somehow forget about the lawyers. You have to come face to face. So 2003 was a year that the government repossessed a lot of the MCI possessions. So the public story was that the group people representing Free World Dial from the petition went to Washington. The reality is we went to an MCI building. And it was sort of like being on the set of Law and Order, because on the second floor it said Computer Crimes Division. And 10 of us walk in, there are 3 people from the government, only 2 people introduced themselves, and we felt so creeped out. And we're looking for cameras to figure out who's listening. And the conversation started with like, we're not here to talk about the merits of the petition, our comments are public record, but do you mind answering a few questions? And my friend Ed Guy, who does come to the breakfast when he's around, was sitting there as our CTO. I think within 20 minutes, Ed sweated away 3-4 pounds. I mean, it was so intense. And these people were relentless. And eventually I jumped up. I said, guys, listen, if you think owning free will dialogue will help you find the terrorists, it's yours. If you want to host it, it's yours. And they start looking at each other, like, what the fuck? And I just basically, as animated as I could be, I went in and I said, it's for you. And they did not know what went on. But I left that meeting with one new friend in Washington, although we didn't hug it out. And then the next day, we went to the White House. President Bush had a telecom czar named Richard something. And we go there, and what's crazy was this was also an outsourced, this was the west wing of the White House, but an annexed building, because it wasn't on that property. And it was a 2-story elevator we went up, and we went to this guy, Richard, we pitch him, and he was so excited, he tells us that, President Bush was behind free will dialogue petition, we good for broadband in America, blah, blah, blah. And we're so bored out of this, because we just deal with the FBI and DOJ the day before. And so we very quietly make our pitch, we walk out, and this guy had glass office, like his entire office was glass, and he saw us walking to the elevator, which was like right outside his office. As the doors were closing, he opened up his door and says, "Thank you for not asking for subsidies." I'm saying, fuck, we're putting out subsidies from who? Oh my God. And then 9 months later, on February 12th, 2004, in a very controversial ruling, Michael Powell, son of Colin Powell, issued something called the Pulver Order. And from that point forward is the reason why they said that voice communication on the public internet is not to be regulated as telecom. And that's why Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, and Google are not regulated as telecom providers. And while their apps are all free, at least they're not subject to, they could charge if they want to, but they've been free. And the Pulver Order is honored in over 100 countries around the world. And it became a Stanford Business School's case study introduced in November 2004, which I do have to say was the most anxious hour of my life. So I met with those professors all summer long after I did this, and they introduced me to, they had me come to the class at Stanford. They literally made me sit on my hands for an hour while they introduced the case. And then I had a half hour to meet some of the most amazing MBA students, brilliant, off the charts, telling me what they would have done in my circumstance. I had to acknowledge that they were brilliant people, but they didn't get me, but it was okay. But being a misfit, has its advantages.